everyone, welcome back to Learn Conversational English. I'm Jenny.
And I'm John. Today we're talking about something that's really important to many newcomers to Canada: how to apply for Canadian citizenship.
Yes. You know, John, this is actually quite personal for me. My family moved here from China when I was younger, and I remember how exciting but also overwhelming this whole process seemed.
I can imagine. As someone who was born here, I sometimes take for granted how complex this journey can be for newcomers. That's why I wanted to walk through it step by step today.
Actually, let me share a bit more about our family's experience. When my parents started considering citizenship, they were so nervous about whether they would qualify. My mom kept saying, "What if I don't speak English well enough?" Even though she had been working in English for years. Perfect. So let's start with the very first step, confirming your eligibility. John, what does someone need to check before they can even think about applying?
Well, there are several requirements. First, you need to be a permanent resident. That's absolutely essential. Then there's what we call physical presence. You need to have been physically present in Canada for at least 1,095 days in the 5 years before you apply.
That's almost 3 years total.
You also need to be up to date with your taxes, demonstrate language proficiency in English or French, show knowledge of Canada, and have no criminal prohibitions.
The language part can be nerve-wracking for some people. I remember when my parents were going through this, they were so worried about their English, even though they'd been speaking it for years.
That's so relatable. And, it's worth mentioning that there are some exceptions to these requirements. For example, if you're married to a Canadian citizen, you still need to meet the same requirements. Marriage doesn't give you a shortcut to citizenship, but there are special provisions for Canadian Armed Forces members and their families. That's understandable, but here's the good news. If you're between 18 and 54, you only need to demonstrate language ability at Canadian Language Benchmark Level 4. That's actually quite achievable.
That does sound manageable. Now, once someone confirms they meet all these requirements, what's the next step? Before we move on to the application steps, John, I think many listeners might be wondering about dual citizenship. Can you keep your original citizenship when you become Canadian?
The next step is really important. You need to calculate your physical presence using the IRCC calculator. This online tool helps you figure out exactly how many days you've been in Canada.
Great question. Canada does allow dual citizenship, which means you can hold Canadian citizenship along with citizenship from another country. However, it's important to check with your country of origin because some countries don't recognize dual citizenship and might require you to renounce your original citizenship.
Oh, that sounds helpful. I imagine people travel back to visit family quite often. That's exactly what my parents had to research. China doesn't allow dual citizenship, so they had to make that difficult decision. But for them, it was worth it. They felt like Canada was truly their home by then.
Absolutely. The calculator takes into account all your trips outside Canada. You'll need your passport and travel records for this. It's quite detailed. You have to enter every single trip, even short ones to the US.
I bet keeping good records is key here. So after calculating the physical presence, what comes next?
One thing I should mention about the physical presence calculator, people sometimes make mistakes with the dates. You need to be very precise. Even a day trip to the United States counts as time outside Canada. And if you were a temporary resident or protected person before becoming a permanent resident, some of that time might count too, but only at half the value. Then, you need to gather all your required documents. This includes your passport, PR card, tax records for the required years, proof of language proficiency, and passport-style photos.
The tax records, that would be your notice of assessment from the Canada Revenue Agency, right? Speaking of documents, John, what happens if someone has missing documents? Like, what if they lost their passport from a few years ago, or they can't get tax records from another province?
Yes, that's correct. You need to have filed taxes for at least 3 years within the 5-year period. And for language proof, you might need test results from approved tests like IELTS or CELPIP for English or TEF for French.
Good to know. Now, Once all the documents are ready, there's the actual application form, isn't there?
Yes, you need to complete Form CIT-0002. This is the main application form for Canadian citizenship. It's quite comprehensive. It asks about your background, travel history, work history, and personal details.
I imagine it's important to be very accurate with all this information.
Absolutely. Any discrepancies can delay your application significantly. Take your time filling it out and double-check everything. After completing the form, you'll need to pay the application fee.
How much is the fee currently?
It's 630 Canadian dollars for adults. That includes the processing fee and the right of citizenship fee. You can pay online with a credit card or through other accepted methods.
And then you submit everything. I've heard that online submission is preferred now?
That's right. The government really encourages online applications now. It's faster, more secure, and you can track your application status easily. You can still submit by mail if needed, but online is definitely the way to go.
That makes sense. Now, what happens after you submit your application?
Well, first, you might be asked to provide biometrics. That's fingerprints and a photo. Not everyone needs this, but if you do, you'll get instructions on where to go to provide them.
I see. And then you wait for a response?
You'll receive an acknowledgement letter with your file number fairly quickly, usually within a few weeks. This file number is super important because you'll use it to track your application and for all future correspondence.
And then comes what many people are most nervous about, the citizenship test, right?
Yes, but honestly, it's not as scary as people think. The test has 20 multiple-choice questions, and you need to get 15 correct to pass. That's 75%.
What kind of topics does it cover? I imagine it's about Canadian history and government.
The test covers Canadian history, geography, government, laws, and symbols. There's a great study guide called Discover Canada that covers everything you need to know. I actually learned some things reading it myself.
That's great. Growing up here, I probably learned a lot of this in school, but it's nice to have it all in one place for people who are studying.
Now, some people might also need a language assessment during this stage. This happens if the citizenship officer isn't completely sure about your language abilities based on your application.
What does that involve?
It's usually a brief conversation with the citizenship officer to assess your speaking and listening skills. They want to make sure you can handle everyday situations in English or French.
That sounds reasonable. And if everything goes well with the test and any assessments, what's the final step?
The final step is the citizenship ceremony. This is really the highlight of the whole process. You'll take the oath of citizenship, which is a promise to be a faithful citizen of Canada.
I've heard these ceremonies are quite moving. Friends of my parents who went through this said it was very emotional.
I've attended a few as a guest, and they really are special. You're surrounded by people from all over the world who are all taking this important step together. After the oath, you officially become a Canadian citizen and receive your citizenship certificate.
And then, if someone wants to, they can apply for a Canadian passport, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd recommend doing this fairly soon after your ceremony. Your citizenship certificate is the key document you'll need for the passport application. Having a Canadian passport makes travel much easier and gives you that extra sense of belonging.
John, let's talk about timing. How long does this whole process typically take from application to ceremony?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, the timing can vary quite a bit. Currently, IRCC says most applications are processed within 12 months, but it can be longer depending on your specific situation and how busy they are.
So patience is definitely required.
Yes, patience is key, but the wait is worth it. And you know what? During that waiting period, you can start preparing for the test and really learning about Canadian history and culture.
That's such a positive way to look at it. Any final tips for our listeners who might be considering this journey?
I'd say start early with your record keeping. Keep track of all your trips outside Canada, make sure your taxes are up to date, and don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. There are many settlement agencies across Canada that can provide guidance.
And I'd add, don't be discouraged by the process. Yes, it involves paperwork and waiting, but it's also a celebration of your commitment to Canada. The fact that you're even considering this step shows how much this country means to you.
That's beautifully put, Jenny. And remember, becoming a Canadian citizen doesn't mean you have to give up your connection to your heritage. Canada celebrates diversity.
So true. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. To recap quickly, check eligibility, calculate physical presence, gather documents, complete the application, pay the fee, submit online, potentially provide biometrics, wait for your file number, take the citizenship test, possibly do a language assessment, attend the ceremony, and then apply for your passport.
That's a perfect summary. Thanks for sharing your perspective today, Jenny. It really helps to hear from someone whose family has been through this process.
Thanks for having this conversation with me, John. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us today. We hope this has been helpful for anyone considering Canadian citizenship.
Until next time, keep practicing your English and embrace your Canadian journey. Take care.